My name's Chris Hatley. I'm the CEO of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia. Delighted to welcome you all here this morning for the second in this series of webinars on social sciences and space. Before we begin, I'm going to share an Acknowledgement of Country video that the Academy has made for such meetings.
Wherever you are across Australia,
we acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of this land.
The Darug peoples,
the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation,
the Gundungurra people of the Southern Highlands,
the Ngunnawal people of the Canberra region on whose country we are standing,
and all other peoples of this vast continent.
Their ongoing connection through custodianship of its land and waters,
physical and spiritual,
through culture, language and ceremony.
Where sovereignty was never ceded, we pay our respects to elders past, present and still to come.
Thank you. So I'm joining here from Ngunnawal country in Canberra, and I pay my respects of all of the traditional owners here and elsewhere, and I welcome all of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues. We're delighted to have Gila here as one of our panellists, and to anyone else in the audience as well. Just a few housekeeping matters before we get started. The chat function everyone will be familiar with from no doubt countless Zoom meetings over the past 18 months or so. You'll be able to share messages with everyone in the audience or with panellists directly. Perhaps just as a good practice, people might like to type into the chat the traditional lands from which they're joining this webinar as well. I will now introduce our series convener, Professor Roy Mcleod, and Roy will give a bit of a brief introduction to the panel, and then he will introduce our moderator for today's session. So Roy is a fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia. He is also a fellow of the Academy of the Humanities, and he has put considerable time in with other colleagues to pulling this series together. And if you haven't done so already, I'd encourage you to go to the Academy's website and have a look at some of the other webinars that are being presented over the next couple of weeks. We've got some really fascinating topics covered in this wonderful series put together by Roy. Over to you, Roy.
Thank you, Chris, very much indeed, and welcome to everybody. I'm so glad that you've been able to find time to join us. Fortunately, we're all more or less in the time zone, which isn't the case with everybody, and with all our participants, I think. I bear you greetings from Cammeraygal people country, and I'm in North Sydney, and I'm pleased to introduce our session of the emerging agenda for the social sciences, in particular in Australia. My name is Roy Mcleod. I'm a historian of science and emeritus professor of history at Sydney University. As one born in the Kennedy generation, seems so long ago, who's lived with space for most of my life, I would like to share with you in this session my interest and passion and concern for the future of Australia in space, and for the particular role that Australia may play. And that role, I think, requires us to look very closely to Australian Aboriginal heritage. Some may say, of course, that to launch a series of this sort in the midst of the worst pandemic in a century isn't a very bright idea. And certainly in no way must we let our attention be distracted from these urgencies. Still, I'd like to sit with you and let me help you slip the surly bonds of earth, and with lifting minds, consider what may be awaiting us and may well be upon us even before the end of the present decade. And for many, the idea that we in Australia and on Earth will be active in space is already a given. During the last 2 years, few will have missed the rapid series of events related to space occurring around the world. We've seen the 50th anniversary of the lunar landing, China returning first samples of Earth from the moon. First, we've seen in over 40 years. We've seen the International Space Station celebrating its 20th anniversary. And we've seen the European Space Agency doing much in relation to solar exploration. And in general, I think we've now begun to find ourselves looking to a time where we're approaching, if you like, the landing on the moon. China has ambitions for this from as early as 2024. Well, the work that we've seen so far has been dominated, of course, by science and technology, quite rightly so. But I think we've also seen the arrival of new forms of human endeavor, some of which some people find questionable. So one in the space of space tourism, led by Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson, soon to be followed, I think, by Elon Musk. Space has become a very human enterprise, replete with human stories of competition and controversy. And many see in this a real danger of principles and possibilities being rushed by commercialization, raising questions about the ethics and behavior that should frame our perspective in space. Meanwhile, of course, the hard work of space diplomacy has proceeded. Nations have long debated the need to strengthen the promise of the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. And so far, 12 countries have become signatories to the Artemis Accord, which NASA helped promulgate to create, in its words, a safe and transparent environment that facilitates exploration, science, and commercial activities for all of humanity to enjoy. But this expression of interest may also be an expression of self-interest. And we have in the social sciences and human sciences to think hard about what we are to say of this and how we are to conduct ourselves and behave towards the new environments that we encounter. Do we do so as nation states or as communities? And how will our interaction be driven? Will it be dominated by a few, or will it be conducted in the interests of the many? Well, all these questions naturally force us to reflect upon the role the social sciences ought to play, hand in hand with the natural sciences and technologies. And I believe it's also time to fashion a focus on Australia and Australia's present and participation in the whole endeavor. As several historians of space, Kerry Doherty and others, have recorded, Australia already has a long history of engagement in space, over 50 years, one way and another. And since 2018, we have our own space agency. So far, modest government investment that we hope will open new frontiers. We all know there's been excellent media coverage, and there are now several centers devoted to space law, strategy, and defense. But as social scientists have often said, and I think we have to take greater account of, we must ask even more fundamental questions, not only about the how, but also about the whether and the why, and to what ends, and with what consequences. We must ask what, in whose interest we are doing all this as Australians, as Earthlings venture first to the moon and then to Mars and beyond. And if in this context, I think there is a great deal to be learned, to be gathered, to be taken into account, to be respected, perhaps even to be applied from what we can learn from our Australian First Nations. And in this, I stand ready to be informed and educated. It's in this light that our series has been devised, and the 9 sessions, of which this is the second, have been devised. 9 moderators have accepted, and they will draw upon their respective discourses of culture, history, health, heritage, law, diplomacy, industry. And I think all have something to add to the wider conversation. To conclude the series, the very end, in 2 weeks' time, we've asked 2 generations of young Australians, recent graduates, and some still in school, to join us to reflect upon the prospect of their own spacefaring futures. We hope you'll enjoy this and participate in our conversation through the chat medium. All sessions will be recorded and made available for later viewing. Warm acknowledgements go to all members of all teams and to the many who have helped us in these difficult times. At the moment, let me start by thanking Chris Hatherley and the Academy of the Social Sciences and my colleagues at the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Sydney, and our guides, Jose Torrealba and Jacob Craig, and most especially my colleague, Ms. Claire McFarlane, for getting us safely underway. May I now invite Rosalind to take us through and take us forward.
Thank you, Roy. I'm Ros Haynes, and I'm living in Orange, which is Wiradjuri country. And I too would like to pay my respects to the elders, past and present, and those who are coming along in the future for this wonderful country that I enjoy so much. I first became interested in Aboriginal astronomy in 1987, so long ago, last century, when my husband Raymond, who's an astrophysicist, and I were asked to write a book on the history of Australian astronomy. And we're talking about this at breakfast one morning, and one of our daughters said, well, of course you're going to start with Aboriginal astronomy, Mum, aren't you? And I said, yes, of course. And I have to confess, sadly, that it hadn't been on the agenda until that point. So I thought, wow, this is a great opportunity to find this out. But it was very difficult to find anything out back then because very little had been recorded. All I could access through libraries was some accounts from missionaries and from early anthropologists, whereas now Aboriginal astronomy is up and flying and is a most popular subject at universities and for theses, and there is so much available. And Aboriginal people themselves have generously shared so many of their stories, as Gila is going to do in a few minutes. So I'm very keen about this seminar, and I'm most grateful to Roy for inviting me to moderate this. And I'm very grateful to my wonderful panelists. Of these, I have the first one who's going to speak is Gila Anderson, who's a senior lawman of the Yulari people and an Aboriginal activist, and his interests have formerly been in law and politics, but I understand that now his main interest is in making sure that his knowledge as an elder is passed on to as wider audience as possible. Gila is not a stranger to astronomy. Only in a month or so ago, he's had an asteroid named in his honour, 140 Gila, and that is a very great honour internationally to have that happen. He's been giving oral presentations of Aboriginal stories of the universe, and recently he reached a much wider audience with the film Star Stories of the Dreaming, which we're going to put a link up for people to access as they can on the web. And in these star stories, he has revealed ancient stories of the stars, black holes, and the creation of the natural world. So we will listen with great interest to what Gila tells us. My second speaker will be Dr. Philip Clark, who is a consultant anthropologist based in Adelaide. And in this capacity, he's currently working on land rights and native title claims, as well as investigating Indigenous heritage issues. He has conducted fieldwork for over 40 years with a wide range of Aboriginal communities and provided advice to government agencies, universities, corporations, and Indigenous representative bodies. And now he's going to advise us too. His specialty is in the ethnosciences as a means of illustrating how culture determines and shapes the many ways that people perceive the universe. And this perspective is very, very important to us as we think about and embark on the space age in reality, not just theory. My third speaker is Professor Ray Norris, who is a research professor at Western Sydney University and Emeritus Fellow at CSIRO Space and Astronomy. In his previous career, he was a director of the Australian Astronomy Major National Research Facility. There should be an acronym for that. And he now studies the distant universe, including initiating the evolutionary map of the universe. And there is an acronym for that. It's called EMU, which is, as you'll find out, very appropriate. He also studies astronomy of the Indigenous Australians and is fascinated by their many intellectual achievements as they have sought to understand their universe. So we have perspectives from an Aboriginal elder, an anthropologist, and an astronomer. And I just want to say a few introductory remarks from my own journey with Aboriginal astronomy. Firstly, I learned a lot that the Aborigines are certainly the world's first astronomers. There can be no doubt of that. Long before the Egyptians, the Greeks, and everyone else we might like to think about, they were observing the stars. And you have to say that in most of the skies of Australia, they had the best observing conditions you could possibly have for naked eye astronomy. And they recognised even inconspicuous star groups that seasoned amateurs would find difficult to discover in amongst the many, many stars in our sky. But what they did with their knowledge was what interested me most, because it was intrinsically different from what Western astronomers do with their observational data. They didn't do observations out of curiosity or just for their own sake. They had very pragmatic reasons for observing the stars. Firstly, the stars were an ongoing calendar, a calendar to notice correlations between the positions of the constellations in the sky with natural events on the Earth, and hence to predict weather conditions, availability of particular foods, tides, arrival of the Macassan traders in the North Coast who traded bêche de mer for various other items which were useful. And all of these things were to do with physical survival. It was very important to have that calendar because you could rely on it year in, year out. It was there. Secondly, and this in some ways was perhaps more important, there was a strong correlation through the stories of the dreaming with the constellations in the sky and the lore of the ancestors, which told them about why the land had been created and how they were to live with it, how they were to behave and care for it, and how they would continue the tribal identity in relation to country. So for all these purposes, when the constellations appeared in the early evening or late in the morning, depended on the place, the stories were told, and all of this was reinforced generation after generation. And that is what has enabled the Aboriginal people to preserve their culture for so long in our country. And there are so many stories of these that we're going to hear about, some from Uncle Gila. But in thinking about these things, I thought this is such a challenge to Western science. We think science is objective, that it's based on facts and that it doesn't involve assumptions. But when we look at the differences between Western science and Aboriginal astronomy, we see that a lot of the things we take for granted are in fact assumptions which are challenged by the Aboriginal perspective. Firstly, that the observer is not not involved in what he or she observes. And even many, many decades after Heisenberg, most scientists still think that they can observe something and it isn't changed by the fact that they're observing it. Whereas Aboriginal people know that the observer is closely related to nature, that nature is not other out there. Nature is in relationship to people. Secondly, that nature is in Western science mostly to be controlled, to be exploited, to be modified for our purposes. That if we can do it, then we should do it, and we will do it. But in Aboriginal custom, nature is to be cooperated with, to be cared for, to be accepted as the giver of all the things we value. And in return, we care for nature. Thirdly, that Western science assumes that understanding comes from analysis, breaking things down into their component parts so that we can then understand how they fit together. Whereas understanding for Aboriginal people comes from synthesis, for seeing each thing as part of a whole. And that whole includes the sky world, the earth, the water world. Everything is one thing. It is a universe. And lastly, Western scientists have the belief that all knowledge is good, that if we can find out about something, then we should. And only very recently have we had ethics committees who look into these things and say, well, maybe you should put a moratorium on this research. But there is no way of enforcing that. If people want to find out things, they will. And you can't put things back in Pandora's box, as we know. But Aboriginal people know that knowledge needs to be regulated so as not to destroy. And therefore, knowledge is imparted to people only as they are considered wise enough to be able to use it and to accept it. So with that preamble, I'm happy to ask Gila if he will enlighten us about some of the actual stories that he thinks are most important in this context. Thank you, Gila.
Thank you, and hello to everybody, and great to see you all connecting. And yeah, look, I want to present a few things, but first allow me to say that I'm on my country, the Uali country, and locked in here, well away from all the sickness of the world. And I want to stay as far away as I can from that, as with my mob. Let me just say that I acknowledge all those, all of you guys who are connected here, and that pay tribute to the elders of those countries and of the ones who suffered the gross violations of colonisation in the early days, and those who continue to suffer from those traumas. And we're trying to say to people now, you have no idea what they attempted to do in terms of destroying our people, and they have no idea of the knowledge that has gone from some people. And fortunately, there are those of us whose ancestors and recent departed have been able to maintain and be able to pass on to us so that we understand our world. And now we want to sort of start saying to people, you know, stop looking at us as foreigners and aliens. We are who we are, and we know this land very well. And so with that, I'll say this, that thank you for your opening remarks, Rosalind, and I will sort of just make a few comments around what you've said. But let me say this to you, that when we look at the sky at night time and we look at the earth in the daytime, We don't see us as being separate from that. We are one. There's a wholeness. You know, where Ray will speak to you about the universe, I've no doubt, because he has a better take on that. We just see what's up there, and we know that we're part of that. And the sky for us represents the patriarchy. That's in our law. The earth is the matriarchy, and this is where the nurturing takes place. This is where the growing up takes place, and all that's on the earth are children. And we are only here for a certain time. And so that everything in humanity, be they a bee, butterfly, or an ant, or fish, or a bird, or human, we are all here just for a certain period of time. And we have a role to play. And part of that role, of course, is making sure that knowledge is passed on and that we keep everything functioning. Now, you made reference, Rosalind, to the fact that we use the sky in some part as a calendar. That's true. For my mob, the Yulia, we have 6 primary seasons, and these seasons are dictated to and we're informed of those seasonal changes by looking at the stars. Not only that, the stars also serve to tell us of our own landmass here, so that we can, when we read the stars, we're reading our own country, because we get stories that relate to every part in that sky up there, and it's represented here on Earth and within our own domain and beyond, because we can talk about other places as well from those stars, because we got that story, and we're able to tell those stories because of the song lines that we have that connects us crisscrossing across this country. And so we can talk about a star way down in the western darkness, standing out there by itself, and there's one little red one that sits down there that nobody can identify for me. And that little red one, he's only there for about an hour in the evening, but he represents the red kangaroo, and that's where him and the emu had a fight over there in Western Australia. And we know where that fight is, because I've been over there and gone through that law with those people, learnt that story and became a master of that knowledge with them under their tutelage. And so I found where that kangaroo is, and where that country is, and where his descendants stayed. I can bring you back here to my country and show you up near Coonabarabran where the emu and kangaroo were born from our country and travel that way. And so we got all of these stories that are connected to that one star, because we tell about that story of that red kangaroo. In the sky, there is a lot of other stuff which Ray and I must catch up on one day, and that's talking about those black holes up there. And because there are things up there that that we talk about with those black holes as well, that represent a totally different world and has totally different meanings for us down here. But a lot of the stuff that we see, the best way to describe it from our perspective is that as above, as is below. So the same thing, we have the stories, and so we can locate those things on Earth. And so the Father, he provides the storms, the weathers to feed and nurture and enable Earth to grow. So there's a whole lot of stories that evolve around in the atmosphere, like weathers and so on, that connects to the stars, and they impact on the weather patterns that exist in Australia and the world for that matter. And by looking at how they communicate, the Father Sky and Mother Earth, we do ceremonies here because we're being told to do ceremonies because we have to maintain communications. And so the ceremonies are done at night time, because then we can see what's up in the sky, and where we relate those stories that we perform here on Earth. We connect them to the country and the country that's up there in the sky. One of the things that connects all of us together, and most of the, for my mob here, is that big river in the sky. We call him Warrambur, and Warrnambool is that big river in the sky, and that's the Milky Way. And of course, the Milky Way then sets up what we first heard, that Scottish word called moiety. And so moiety is to divide the world into two parts. And so when we look at that sky up there, we're looking at how that river divides people. So on Earth here, the rivers divide the different mobs, so it establishes certain rules around marriages and our connection to family and country and responsibility to country here on Earth. And there's a whole range of stories that go with that I will not go into. But the other thing about Father Sky and Mother Earth, and what disturbs us about all this space exploration that's going on with these guys setting up these tourism flights up there, they have absolutely no bloody idea what they're doing. It's all lovely and beautiful and all that sort of thing to look back down on Earth. But when they get up there, I think their minds might change, that if they keep going the way they are, then they're going to destroy what they see as beauty back here when they're looking out their windows back at Earth. The planting and proposed talking about developing, these outer space modules to develop colonies on the moon or colonies on Mars. That to us is an absolute, I suppose, total destruction of what is there and what's been developed. Because you see, that moon for us is very important. For us, that moon in the shadows, in the darkness of the moon, there are certain sacred things that take place here that we talk about here, and that relates to the continuation of the humans on Earth and our spirits. And if you keep interfering with that moon up there, then it's going to have a significant impact on the populations on Earth. And so I'll leave it at that. The other thing that's going on as well, Sorry, I was going to say that what you've said, Gila, will promote a lot of questions, I'm sure. And we should perhaps move on to Philip. But if you have one last thing to say, that would be great. Yeah, just one more thing. The relationship between the moon, the Earth, and the sun is very important, because the sun is one of the wives, the fourth wife of our Creator. And unlike America and other places where patriarchy dominates, that is a woman up there, and she gets angry because of her love for the moon, which is the representation. And this is represented. The anger is represented by extreme heat and droughts on this Earth. And if people are messing up here, then that their sun is going to cast extreme heat upon us, because she's angry at what's being done to her co-wife, who is Mother Earth. And so we're seeing some devastation occurring to that. And we have these prophecies that are deep within our teachings.
Thank you very much, Gila. And I'm sure that will produce a lot of questions at the end of the session. Now, Philip, would you like to give us an anthropologist's track on this?
Yes, well, I'll try to. I'm talking from Adelaide, which is Kaurna country, the country of the Kaurna traditional owners. I'm sitting not that far away from what we call the River Torrens. It's probably more a creek compared to the eastern states, but that runs through the plains. And of course, from a Kaurna perspective, that's a continuation from the Milky Way, the creek, the Wadleypurra, the creek with all the huts along it, the Milky Way. So just bearing in mind some of the things that Gillard said about what's above and what's below is the same. Anthropology is an external perspective. So right from the outset, I'm going to apologise in advance. So talking about cultures from an outsider's point of view. And there is tension between what could be an Indigenous point of view of how the universe works and put together, and how, say, a scientist or a scholar would see things. So that tension's there. That tension is between all sorts of knowledge systems. And I'm sure if I was giving a talk about the astronomical or anthropological elements of the Bible, that with 3 wise men following a star across the desert, that same tension would be there. So that's just something we have to acknowledge. Anthropologists sort of draw upon what we call ethnography. They're sort of the details that we get direct from Indigenous people about their worldview, what they do. And that's quite a tradition of how we sort of deal with all of that. What sort of happened in more recent times, of course, is that scientists are looking at some of that early ethnographic recording, materials maybe even from the very late 18th century, through the early 19th century more recently, and sort of using it to gain insights into whatever they're studying, whether it's fire stick farming or the heavens. As an anthropologist, I'm the one who occasionally throws out the anchor and say, well, I think you perhaps misunderstanding how that information was originally put and what it actually intended. The 2 main areas, Gilard's already mentioned about the different sort of spatial system in terms of what's above and below and under. So yes, clearly there's a different way of looking at space. The early Aboriginal way of looking at it was probably in common with many other cultures around the world, whereby everything was connected to the extent that what you see in the sky world above you is actually part of somehow connected to the land that you're standing on, and same with the underworld. So there are all these passages and ways of connecting those landscapes. Some of the myths talk about, and it's quite a common theme across Australia, about a powerful man being able to throw a spear and have it lodge in the sky. So straight away you can see that a modern Western European view of what's distance isn't translating well in terms of how Aboriginal people are seeing that distance. With the continuation of the landscape above your head, I mean, in some ways it sounds a bit what scientists and science fiction writers call a Dyson sphere, that the space is actually sort of morphing to such an extent that bodies such as the moon and the sun actually pass through the landscapes. And some of the areas where I've worked up in northern Australia, there's actual hills with holes in them where people say, well, the sun or the moon pass through there. So you can see that, again, it's quite a different perspective than what Western European scientists would look at space with almost, well, not quite endless, but trillions and upon trillions of miles. It's quite different. I thought 20 odd years ago, when starting to pull together a lot of these records, I thought that perhaps one could, map them. And in the end, I just came up with just crude sketches. And really, I think if one was to try and accurately represent it, you would end up with those impossible perspective paintings that someone called Escher used to do, whereby the more you look at it, the more you can see that it's folding upon itself. But that's a problem for the scientists trying to make sense of ethnographic information, whether it's from Aboriginal people or Papua New Guineans or someone from Hawaii. But nevertheless, it sits there. So that's an error. That's a possible error for translation for any scientist who wants to just mine the ethnographic record for facts without actually thinking, well, how do all these facts come about? What's happening? The other is the sense of time. Everything it seems in Aboriginal culture, and Gilard's already mentioned this, comes back to a cycle. So Aboriginal people, in common with many other world cultures, have a notion of cyclic time, whereas modern Western Europeans, if you went back several thousand years ago, it would be different perhaps, but modern Western Europeans have a more linear sense of time. So you can sort of think about how many billions of years ago the Earth was formed, and at various stages where continents moved, and then ultimately 50 or 60,000 years ago, the ancestors of Aboriginal people arrived. That's sort of more linear time. But for the Aboriginal people I work with, they just think all of that's just silly because they've got their notion of cyclic time. And that's where, Gillard's mentioned, and so's Rosalind, about the cycles in terms of the seasons, how they link to the stars, particularly the movement of the Pleiades. Seven Sisters, they're often they're ancestors that tend to make things very cold. So there's all these prohibitions about women looking at them and how you deal with the Pleiades. So that's a cycle. But the Aboriginal spirit also cycles. So a lot of those mourning ceremonies, quite important, that happen in Aboriginal Australia, they're about trying to get person's spirit to join back with the ancestors. So that's another cycle. A lot of the ceremonies, they occur in cycles. So there's the sort of endless series of cycles from the Aboriginal point of view. So you can see that over time, events which are important to the cycles will keep getting reproduced, but something that happened tens of thousands of years ago, probably not, if it's not a regular occurring event. What I think, although there's another possible error of translation there when looking at the sense of time and how information that's been recorded in relation to that may be incorrectly interpreted by a Western scholar. What I think with the development of all the literature on what we call traditional ecological knowledge, Aboriginal biocultural knowledge, sort of an understanding of how these knowledge systems come about and what they are, I think there's some real gains there, and there's certainly a lot of interesting work happening in managing parks, fire stick farming, that kind of thing. And it's often ecologists. I think ecologists are actually better positioned to actually see the big picture because of their training. So I think what all this information adds is the holistic view. I think that's the big gift that may come out of the involvement, the working together of Aboriginal people and scientists, and certainly, as I mentioned, in terms of looking at fire stick farming, and Aboriginal people manage so much of the country now, and they've been given back large tracts of land which now have got camels and wild horses and buffalo and all sorts of things that now need to be managed. So the Aboriginal knowledge will rise again as a way of trying to get that and to hopefully blend with Western science to try and work out some of these big problems. I'm probably getting to the end of my time, but I was wanting to looking at the wealth of Aboriginal knowledge we have through the dreaming. It's often called the dreaming. Some people call it stories, myth, history, so a variety of English names, but Jukupa in the Western Desert, where I've done a lot of, that's an enormous body of knowledge, but it is dynamic. I mean, there was mention of the Macassans, and they're been coming the last couple of 100 years to get Biche de Mer, the sea slug. But their arrival, come seasonally, that was put into the cycles, and they're symbolically immensely important for the top end, particularly in Arnhem Land. In fact, to the extent that a lot of Macassan words have entered the Aboriginal language. So I wanted to leave the thought that although the ancestors of the Aboriginal people arrived here 50,000 years, the Australian continent's changed quite a bit. There's been, very cold periods, very hot periods, dry, wet, but so too is their culture. It's a dynamic culture that has survived so well and thrived on this continent because it does engage with change. So I just want to leave the thoughts a dynamic system. So back in the early 20th century, there were debates about whether that was so, but certainly anthropologists sort of run with that model these days. So I'll hand it back to Rosalind.
Thank you, Philip. That's full of lots of questions, I'm sure. And I hope we'll have time for all the ones we'll get. So now over to Ray, the astronomy perspective on this whole topic. Thank you, Ray.
Thanks, Ros. Thanks, everybody. So I'm in the Blue Mountains in New South Wales, the land of the Darug and Gundungurra people. And behind me, you see those telescopes, which have been an important part of my life. They're up at Narrabri, northern New South Wales, which is Gila's land. That's the Gamilaroi people. and I'd like to acknowledge them as well. So I guess my take on this is something that's impressed me tremendously is the amount of sheer knowledge by the First Nations people about the sky. It's something that really impresses me. I've done lots of work with my mate Bill Yidam-Damahani, who's senior out of the Waterman people, and be walking along at night with Bill, and he'll look up and he'll be able to name every star that I can see with my naked eye, and he has a story about many of them. So it's like 6,000 stars or something. I can maybe name a handful on a good night, But the amount of knowledge that he has, and other elders, and Gila and others, you don't get that by accident. You get that by a lot of hard work and a lot of learning. And many white fellows don't appreciate that to become an elder, you don't have to get old. You have to do an awful lot of work and a lot of learning to become an elder. Elders are respected not because they're old, but because they're good at what they do and they know a lot of stuff. So there are people who actually, Aboriginal people, who spend a lot of their lives studying the sky. And it always amuses me when I give talks and people say, well, did Aboriginal people in traditional tribes, did they actually understand the sky? Did they know the difference in a star and a planet? And, my answer is basically, duh. People have been sitting there looking at the sky for 50,000 years plus, studying it. Of course they know about it. All the planets we see, so you can tell the difference between a planet and a star. Planet moves through the sky relative to the stars. Mars has this really weird movements where it goes forward and it stops, goes back a bit and goes forward again. And Aboriginal elders who know about the sky, well, they know all the planets that we can see with their naked eye, and they'll have names for them. And Bill tells the story how Mars moves, how he's walking along a trail, and he stops and he traces the steps to find something and then moves forward again. So all these things were understood. So people knew about the sky, they tried to understand it. There's a lot of intellectual feats. Let me give some examples. So Gila earlier mentioned the sun and the moon. The sun is this lovely old lady in most Aboriginal cultures throughout Australia, and the moon is a man. It's usually a fairly bad man. But when they get together, they form an eclipse. Let me just talk about that. So if you stand here, if there's a solar eclipse of the day, the sun goes completely dark during the day, and that's because the moon has got in front of it. And many different Aboriginal groups describe this as being the sun woman and the moon man getting together and making love. And I think this is a really old story because you find it right across Australia, many different cultures. So I think that Aboriginal people had figured out that eclipses were caused by the positions of the sun and the moon, and that it's figured out this out a very, very long time ago. And you might say, well, that's not really surprising because after all, these people had been studying the sky. But actually it is surprising because it's not at all obvious. You don't actually see the moon moving in front of the sun. There's another reason it's surprising is that if I'm standing here where I live, I will only see a solar eclipse like once every 10 generations. So chances are I won't see one, my father won't see one, my grandfather won't see one. And yet, if I'm an elder, I have that knowledge of how eclipses work. So that knowledge has been passed over many generations, implies an incredible continuity of culture. There's other things as well. I've talked about the solar eclipse. A lunar eclipse is when the moon goes dark at night because the Earth's shadow, basically the Earth is between the sun and the moon. And people across Australia, again, they describe this as being slightly different from a solar eclipse because in this case, the sun woman has been chasing the moon man, and the moon man runs backwards and forwards trying to escape her clutches, but eventually she catches them, make love, and that's why you get the eclipse. But that isn't about the moon man moving backwards and forwards. The moon has got an incredibly complex motion compared to the sun, and he does wiggle backwards and forwards like that. And And so somebody had spotted that, and you get these fragments of intellectual knowledge coded into the songs and stories. But what really gets me is I've said, well, you can sort of understand how a solar eclipse works because the moon goes in front of the sun. But for a lunar eclipse, the moon is up there when it's being eclipsed and the sun is down there. So how did somebody figure out that that lunar eclipse up there is something to do with the motion of the sun down there? And I have this vision of this Aboriginal Einstein sitting out there in the bush, looking at this, trying to figure out what the heck is going on with this lunar eclipse, and somehow realizing it's to do with the motion of the sun and the moon. And of course, we've got no idea the name of that Aboriginal Einstein. And we just hear about their work through songs and stories. And that's what really fascinates me, is this deep intellectual knowledge. You get it in tides as well. We all know what a tide is, of course. You go to the beach, you see the sea level going up and down by about a metre twice a day. Sometimes you get a really high tide, it goes up and down by about 2 meters. That's usually when you have a full moon. And it's only the last few hundred years we've known this. And if you go back to the time of Galileo, who many of you regard as being one of our greatest scientists, Galileo had no idea whatsoever what caused tides. There's some people who said they thought it's something to do with the moon. And he said, oh, that's rubbish. That's just superstition. No. And he had this weird model about water sloshing down, which is completely wrong. Galileo got it completely wrong. And so I love the fact that the Yolngu people in Arnhem Land, for thousands of years, they've had these stories of how the tides are caused. And they say a tide is caused. Well, you have to understand, you're in Arnhem Land looking out east across the Arafura Sea, beautiful clear sky. You see right to the horizon, and you see the moon coming up through the ocean. And they noticed that when you got a full moon, you had a really big tide. And they reasoned that it's water flowing into the moon. And that's why the water level went down. Some of the water is going to the moon. If you have a half moon, the water doesn't go up and down so much. Now, you might say, well, that's a bit of a quaint explanation. And sure, if you know about positions of planets and things, you might disagree with that model. But the fact is, it worked. And if I go to a Yolngu man and say, what's the tide going to be like tonight? He can look up at the moon and say, yeah, it's a full moon, it's going to be a big tide, it'll be about 8 o'clock this evening. Galileo would have no idea whatsoever. So I would argue that Aboriginal people really were doing science. They were trying to understand their world. And that story has predictive power, which is what we ask for science. So to summarise, we've heard a lot about the holistic Aboriginal view. By the way, Gila said about this close relationship between the earth and the sky. You do realise that the stuff of which we're made, my finger there, is made of atoms like carbon and sulfur and calcium, and all those atoms, they came from stars which were exploded. So where's the hydrogen in my body? They have come from the Big Bang. These other atoms are bits of dead star. We are all children of the stars. We would not exist if other stars hadn't been there before us and exploded and rained these elements back on what became the Earth. So we are very much children of the stars. And I would say that what we can learn from Indigenous people is this holistic view, the sky and the earth. They are not separated. They are our environment. We should respect the sky just like we respect the land, or some of us respect the land at least. We should not be putting up vast fleets of satellites so you can't observe the beauty of the stars. Those stars are really important to us. They play a deeply fundamental role in the human psyche. And I think as we embark into space, which I think is a good thing, but we need to do so in a respectful way. And we need to respect space and respect the sky. And we mustn't ruin our skies the way we seem to have ruined our land. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. I think you've already given a wonderful summary of pretty much everything that people have said. And it's especially interesting to see the immense powers of observation, and the way that observation was interpreted and built into a model which was coded in the stories, the songlines of the dreaming. And I think that is such a gift that we in Australia particularly have, that we can contribute to the whole idea and the morality and the ethics of our journey into space. So I would like to invite questions from anybody who'd like to send them in through the Q&A, and we'll ask our panellists to speak to those. Thank you. I see we have one already from Graham Orr, who asks, are there ethical constraints on stellar astronomy or only on solar system study? Can Western astronomy be both labelled dispassionate or academic, yet also a form of risky technology? Ray, that might be one for you to start with, if you would.
Yeah, it's a really nice question, actually. One of the things I like about astronomy is that, unlike some other areas of science, we don't carve things up. We don't break things to see what they're made of. We stand on the ground and we look up into the sky with our telescopes, but we're basically observers. And we're building a big new telescope over in Western Australia at the moment. We have a really good relationship with the local Indigenous people, the Umji people. And they say that they like our science, because, well, we're not a mining company, first of all, but we don't carve up the ground. We stand on the ground serenely. We respect their land. We make sure we don't damage their land. We place our telescopes on the land and we look with them serenely into the sky. So I think astronomy like that is pretty safe. You don't cause damage. I don't think there are ethics around astronomy. But I'm waiting for someone to tell me I'm wrong.
Well, perhaps if I could add,
Yes, Philip.
there are probably, and Gila may want to go into this more deeply, but there are probably issues with the names that may be taken to name constellations and, so basically mining Aboriginal languages for appropriate names. I recently communicated with a paleontologist who thought he was doing the right thing by naming a genus of long extinct snake after a name for a rainbow serpent, and which he got out of an ethnography. But it turned out that the community today consider that a secret, sacred name, or at least not so much one that can't be spoken, but it shouldn't be said publicly. Now, it hasn't done a hell of a lot of damage, because after all, unless you're a paleontologist, you wouldn't necessarily be reading about it in books. But it does show that when you appropriate information, you may be doing it for the right reason. One does need to check to make sure that the people who are connected with that language, if you're taking a name from it, are happy with the way that you're using it. And I spent almost 30 years in the museum, and of course that was a problem. Well, not a problem, but a thing we always had to do to make sure that we could have the community along with us, and they were happy with the way that we were displaying their culture, if it was artifacts or needing to get some insight from their culture. But anyway, that's my take on it.
Thanks, Philip. Gila, have you got a take on
I just want to say around the ethics of naming things. I have an issue. My people have always had an issue with this. When they, put the Southern Cross on the flag of Australia, and they look down there at that Southern Cross and they relate to the crucifixion. That for us is a bit of an issue, because we don't see that as a crucifixion. We see that as a place where the cockatoos are sitting up in that big old yarran tree on the bank of the river. It's a dead tree, but they're sitting there and they're showing us the way to go home, where the spirits are going to go from our ancestors. But that big star that's down there on the flag that sits down on it by itself, for us, that flag is the fire. That's the sacred fire that burns, where the mothers who bore children on this earth, they sit there and wait for the last child that they bore on this earth to come and greet them at that fire before they're able to go home to what we call Bulima, which is the sky camp where they live forever with their ancestors. And so, yeah, I have a real issue with that, and a lot of my mob, want to deal with that at some stage.
Thank you. Well, maybe in some future time when we get a new flag, there will have been conversations with Aboriginal people about what it should be, which there certainly wasn't for this one, I'm sure.
I just say, I think the key to all of this is respect.
Yeah.
When you do things, you respect other people, you respect the country, the sky. If you're going to use someone's name for something, you get their permission. It's pretty obvious.
Yeah, quite. Well, we have another question here from Lindis Conlon, who says, from a lab-based scientist, thanks all. How can we better integrate traditional scientific approaches to our thinking and scientific method as researchers? How can we as researchers, I guess, integrate traditional scientific approaches to our thinking and scientific method? Who would like to have a go at that?
Well, perhaps I'll just start by saying that the growing literature on from scientists about traditional ecological knowledge and Indigenous biocultural knowledge, sometimes with other terms using it, is sort of providing a bit of a framework in terms of both practically how to engage with Indigenous communities. And look, this may be Indigenous community in Central Africa. It's not, not just literature specific to Australia. But also there's sort of a framework whereby you can, you can actually start to see how the information sits within that culture. So as I said in my bit, there's so many possible areas of translation that one really has to drill deeper into the culture behind that information. And of course, that has, as I think Gillard and others have said, that requires setting up a very close working relationship with the Indigenous people who are providing information, so that you're respecting them, but also they've got a chance of actually educating you as a scientist. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
Can I just say this, that that in the early stages when I was learning, one of my mentors, ceremonial elders, he used to always have a drink of port wine every morning, and he'd have a couple of pints of that port wine, but he'd never get drunk. And one day we were out bush and I asked him, how come you have that drink every morning, old man? Is that good for your health or what? He said, no, it's good to keep them white fellas away from me because they can smell the grog on me, so they won't come and ask me all them questions all the time. He said, and they always had a problem because, and I think we need to go right into the heart of this at some stage with the government, because when we begin to talk about ethics and morality, we need to understand that our people were very scared to tell white people stories because they go away and write a book and then they own that information. They take the IP through the publication of those books, and we lose that. We lose ownership. And that's our greatest fear. And that's the same as what we're now still fearing. And we believe now that we need to get governments to pass laws that regulates how we treat IP, intellectual property rights of Aboriginal people, and our knowledge, because and we need to protect that very carefully, because we don't want the big pharma companies to take control and ownership, nor do we want Bayer and Monsanto's to take ownership of our seeds in this country, and use that for commercial reasons. No, that's for that's for existence on Earth, and that's free of charge.
Thank you. Ray, do you have a
Oh, I'll just follow up something Gila said. It's about the intellectual property aspect. So Big Pharma is in Australia. They are looking at bush medicines. They are making money out of bush medicines. We have no effective way of, and that, which is good. I mean, it's good that these remedies are, the whole of the human race can take advantage of them. But the Indigenous people who provide that knowledge, they should be paid for that knowledge. And we've got no good way in Australia of doing that, of recognising the intellectual property and making sure the people who own that intellectual property get the benefits of sharing with the rest of us. That's something we really need to do.
Well, so many things to think about, so many things to implement. And I thank my panellists, our panellists, very sincerely for their input, for the knowledge and the reflection on that knowledge. And I think this has been a wonderful session and a very important one as we embark on joining in the so-called space race. And there are many, many issues that we need to take on board. Roy, would you like to conclude the session?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Roz. And thank you all, really, for a very exciting and interesting conversation. I think there is so much to be learned and pursued in what you say. I want to invite you all, please, if you can, to find time to observe or participate in the rest of the series. First of all, just ask Roz and we'll equip her with the relevant web links, which I'm sure Chris will supply. Because I think it's very important that each of the other sessions has your perspective in mind, as indeed we must collectively bring this perspective to mind with Space Agency and in other bodies that have an interest in Australia's role in space. Thank you very much, all of you. We've come to the end of our time, I think, now, so we must conclude. But I want also to advertise to all of those who are still watching the next in the series, which is to occur on the 19th, Thursday the 19th at 9 o'clock. It will be called Preparing for a Space Future, Building the Infrastructure. And I think it would be very important that the people there, so I hope some are watching now, will be able to take on board some of the things that you are saying, because infrastructure very automatically implies the notion of taking into account what one ought to have learned from the past in building the future. Thank you all very much once again, and I hope we personally keep in touch as the conversation unfolds and continues. Thank you again, Roz.
Thanks.
Over to you, Roz.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Details for the subsequent sessions are in the chat, and we hope to see you there. Thanks to all the panelists, and thanks, Roy.
Chris, where will you put up the link for people to watch this afterwards?
It'll be on the same registration page as on the Academy of the Social Sciences website. Right. We've got everyone's detail, all the attendees, and we'll be able to send that later. Thank you again.
Thanks so much.
Bye, everybody.
Cheers.